Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Going to get right to finishing up the class series with a special guest for the grand finale here. And he's what do you call it? He's double booked. He's going to be on with Mr. D in a couple hours. I'll mention that in a moment. But all I want to say right now is um, support for the show is gratefully received at Subscribestar. See the video link on YouTube, if video description on YouTube. If you're watching this on Twitter, you can find that. And a few people throw in $5 a months each, and it adds up and lets me pay my graphic designer and stuff like that. Okay, that's that. Now, if I press the right button here, we have Christopher Sandbach. Welcome, sir.
How's it going?
Now, you've read this book by Paul Fussell in the past. You told me.
I read it a long
Yeah.
time ago, and then I refreshed myself with it today.
Yeah.
But you know what's sort of interesting? My friend Return Sanity, she's on Twitter as MWA. She loves this book, and so like I'm also passingly familiar just talking about it with her. And then also Paul I never know, despite his name being spelled almost exactly like two of my names, I don't know if it's Fussell or Fussell.
I actually don't know either.
But he has another book that is far closer to my heart than this one is. Entitled "The Great War in Modern Memory," which
Yeah,
I think is
no.
probably
That's how I knew about him, because he came to the Mises Institute. I did not meet him, but he had come to the Mises Institute to speak about that stuff.
Did he really?
Oh,
Very
yeah.
interesting. That's a book
There's a
that has
recording.
been sort of.
There's a recording of him at Mises.org giving a talk on that stuff, if I remember.
I'm gonna have to look at that one, because that book is
Yeah.
very dear to me. Like that,
Yeah.
and it's been like sort of derided critically, and like everything else in academia, they hate it because it's good. Is the reason.
Okay, that's a
So
whole rabbit
anytime,
hole I want to go down, but
it,
I can go down many rabbit holes with you. Okay, so let me just review for folks who are just jumping in. Paul Fussell gives an anatomy of class. In fact, I'll just pull it up right now. Make sure, yeah, okay, right, and he talks about various ways that you can talk about classes, and even throughout the book, he says, hey, well, here's something that you like never see with the lowers, and you always see with the uppers, and and vice versa and stuff. So there's lots of different ways to divide this, but for the purpose of the book, he settles on this 9-class division with the top out of sight at the very top. They're the people who are like down the curvy road. Their house is down some curvy road, maybe with a gate at the street, and you never see
it's
their house.
real old money.
Yeah, you never
Real
see
old
them.
money.
You never see their house. They are not living on their income, or their income is not a significant part of what they're living on. They're living on inheritance. Then you get to the upper and upper middle. These are like very, very high income people, maybe. Then you get to the middle class. Then he breaks up proletarian into high, middle, and low. Having introduced mid-proletarian, I have to say he doesn't talk about them a whole lot. He talks just about high and low a lot. And then at the bottom, you have destitute. And as Sandbach was saying, unusually under that, he introduces another one, and he names it bottom out of sight, purposely echoing top out of sight, because he sees some odd parallels between them. One of the obvious ones being in the name of the classes, that you don't see the bottom out of sight people. They're in an institution, a mental institution, a prison, something like that. They're out of sight.
Or they're at Grateful Dead shows. This is like one of the edges.
So you're saying top out of
things,
sight and bottom out of sight might both be at a Dead show?
yeah. Okay. No, this is a real thing. In fact, when I was talking about this with somebody yesterday, and a guy, and he was talking about how there's like this whole, the Grateful Dead have like this sort of columnar, like sort of almost parallel, like mirror society, where they have their own class structure. I would argue that they've done a really good job of not subdividing into classes, but it's totally true that, I mean, I was at a Dead and Company show. I guess it was about 3 years ago now. It was one of the last shows they played in Virginia, and I was standing in line there. I was standing in line in the concession stand to get my grilled veggie burrito, and two people in front of me was Jerome Powell, and like two people behind me looked like people that like maybe slept in a junkyard last night. So yeah,
Wow.
it's amazing how you see that sort of mirror action. The top out of sight and bottom out of sight, they both tend to like the same things. It's wild.
Huh. Interesting. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Okay, so that's the schemata. Through much of the book, he goes into a lot of detail, which I found really funny a lot of the times. His observations are I think, acute and hilarious about how the different classes behave, how they decorate their house, what they read, how they write, how they speak. All kinds of details, right? Which we've been going through in this series. We're going to conclude the series with his last two chapters, one of which talks about climbing and sinking and Prole Drift. And then I really brought on Sam Batch for the very final chapter, excuse me, called The X Way Out. And we'll see what we think. I saw at least some reviewers thought that the book was very strong until that very final chapter. So we'll see what Sam Batch thinks of it. Okay, so real quick on the climbing and sinking and Prole Drift. Most of the book, he's really emphasized that there's a lot of attempts to change class upwards, typically, right? Not always. To change class, but he thinks that class is much more fixed than most Americans especially think, because Americans tend to kind of deny that there's class and stuff like that. And he says, no, you can tell. You can tell by the way people speak and all kinds of a gazillion clues. And once you get past the obligatory, hey, in America, we're all just folks, once you kind of push past that, people will tell you, oh yeah, I mean, I can tell that he's from old money, and people do detect it. They just don't feel comfortable like directly talking about it, right? But anyway, he thinks it's very static as a general thing. So these last two chapters are quite interesting because they're both about, you might say, the dynamics of class, where before he's just like, here's the classes, here's what they are. If you were born this way and brought up this way, you're going to be that way the rest of your life. Then in this chapter on Prole Drift, he says, actually, I do see some shifts, and I do see some people trying to move up and down and just changes in the class system. And then the final chapter, he says, I wonder if there's some people who kind of don't belong in the class system exactly. They've kind of escaped it or something, right? So now we're going to get out of the static picture and get into more dynamic stuff. Okay, so read a little bit and then just jump in as you have comments, Sam Batch. So he says, August B. Hollingshead said strainers rather than climbers is the name he likes to use for those who try to move upward without in any way making it. And he mentions, this blew my mind, Roseanne Weissman, a Washington, D.C. status therapist. She instructs the ambitious in the technique of social climbing. A status therapist. Beautiful. Amazing. Anyway, okay, so people who are trying to class climb. Some of the most assiduous class climbers are university professors, Mr. Sam Batch. I wonder what you think of that.
That's the worst group of people on the planet.
C. Wright Mills has their number. Men can achieve position in this field, although they are recruited from the lower middle class, a milieu not remarkable for grace of mind, flexibility, or breadth of culture or scope of imagination. The profession thus includes many persons who have experienced a definite rise in class and status position. It also includes people of typically plebeian cultural interests outside of their field of specialization and a generally Philistine style of life. Now, you actually spent at least probably more time in academia than I did. I only did 5 years total in undergrad and grad. You spent more than that, right?
Off and on, I spent 10 years in academia. Wow. And one of the things I did that other people maybe not do, because I had a really incisive sort of mentor professor who he was very successful, but he would hold court with me, and I would just go sit in his office and he would tell me about faculty politics and the way it works and that sort of thing. So yeah, I've got a and this is it is fascinating to see, because he's talking about specifically an American context, but really you can extrapolate this to the Anglo-American context, because the concept of the Herr Professor is the concept of the hair professor really comes from late 18th century German, sort of German life. But it did rapidly. There is a sort of
And
parallel
so I'm sorry, when
spread
you say
in
hair
what there's.
professor, HERR professor, you don't mean, you mean like
Yeah.
where it goes from being like a job to like this status? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it's an archetypical like sort of position. In fact, if you've ever read All Quiet on the Western Front,
Mm-hmm.
the schoolmaster that incites them all to run off and join the
Yeah,
army
yeah,
is a
yeah.
great example. Oswald Spangler is another great example of the sort of hair professor type. And if
Mm-hmm.
you look at if you look at Spangler, I actually don't, because he's German. I don't know just a whole lot about his background, but the professoriate class it's a class of people that coming out of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there would have been like people who received degrees were actually considered ennobled in some way. They had, there's the three domains. There's the knights temporal, there's the knights spiritual, and that's the clergy, and then there's the knights of the ether, and that would be the professorial class. But
Got it.
as the 18th century, as what Koselleck would call the pathogenesis of modernity progresses, we find that the state, the burgeoning modern state, in its attempt to do simultaneously astroturf a unified national identity, and also to sort of castrate the ancient landed nobility that were possibly more like loyal to one another across national borders than they are
Yeah.
to like their own national peoples.
Right.
We start seeing academies of sciences crop up, and what they
Mm-hmm.
tend to do is recruit people out of not necessarily the lower classes, but like, there would be fewer classes this far
Yeah.
back, or
Right.
the granularity of binning would probably be less, but they're going to tend to recruit people out of the high proletarian and the middle classes, and they
Mm-hmm.
they send them off. But these are people. The most important
I mean,
thing
this is what we saw in like the post World War II era, right? Where you get
yes,
the bright kid from Ohio or something, and he ends up working
right.
at NASA and helping get a man to the moon or something like that, right?
There's a bit of that going. Yeah, there's a bit of that going on. But those people, yeah, the I think they slide over unless they end up working in universities. It is a very special type that usually ends up working in universities. And the important thing about them is they do, in fact, owe their entire status. All of their status comes from their affiliation with this institution. Okay, and so they become sort of personas that are identified with the institution itself, rather than as individuals. Okay, and so this is if you're trying to, they have a particular utility for the state, that maybe they're not necessarily going to be the most well-rounded individuals. I had a communist professor that he was brilliant with respect to Irish literature, but outside of that, he was just a loon.
Yeah, let me just share the next sentence in Paul Fussell. He's talking right there, typically plebeian cultural interests outside their field of specialization. He says, thus the deep instinct of the professor to go bowling, although another part of him will tug upward, dragging him toward costly summers among persons of inherited money at the most solid resorts. So he's talking about a tension, right, between kind of the class they came up with and then what they're aspiring to, and they can flip flop back and forth, right?
And like if you're looking for them, this is a literary archetype. He'll be the guy he has one tweed jacket that doesn't fit real well, and he'll like do things like he'll miss social cues is what they do. Is like a lot of times they'll get like Trump derangement syndrome or something like that at like a relatively nice restaurant and he'll start ranting about Trump when everybody else, even if they don't really like Trump, they've decided just not to talk about that. They tend to miss, they tend to miss social cues that indicate that they've actually grown up in this milieu,
Right.
And that's usually the way you can tell them.
Okay, let me keep going a little bit here in the book. So he says so he talks a little bit about social climbing, and then he says, and I thought this was very interesting, and he's going to get it into more in the final chapter. If social climbing, whether in actuality or in fantasy, is well understood, social sinking is not, although there's more of it going on than most people notice. Male homosexuals and lesbians, respectively, exemplify these two opposite maneuvers. Ambitious male homosexuals aspire to rise. And he talks about, owning antique businesses and art galleries and hair salons. And, right.
What an absurd statement. That's like, it's so true. Like, I could just feel the waves of 1950s conservatism coming off of it right here. It's great.
Lesbians, on the contrary, like to sink, dropping from middle-class status to become taxi drivers, police officers, and construction workers. The ultimate male homosexual social dream is to sit at an elegant dinner table, complete with flowers and doilies and finger bowls, surrounded by rich, successful, superbly suited and gowned, witty and cleverly immoral people. The ultimate lesbian social dream is to pack it in at some matey lunch counter with the heftier proles, wearing work clothes and doing a lot of shouting and kidding. And then here's where it really gets funny. Like lesbians, men of letters sometimes display an inordinate desire to sink in class.
Yeah,
I thought that was so funny. What a transition!
That's a zinger. That's a zinger. It's hard to know how serious he's being there, but there is some.
Well, let me give you some examples. Ready? Now you listed off a bunch of them. Oh, I meant to share that. Anyway, you can do it off the top of your head probably. But let me give you his, and then maybe you can reel off a few. There's T.E. Lawrence entering the Royal Air Force as a ranker, and Norman Mailer allying himself with the murderous prole Jack Henry Abbott. Are they motivated by guilt over the advantages of their classy educations that their classy educations have given them? Let's see. Oh, I'm going to go a little more. Drinking too much is a standard mechanism for class sinking. Writers and the sophisticated also try to sink by affecting the garb of the prole classes, like Ivy students who wear house painters' overalls or join communes. They will dress like the low-status young, becoming what Leslie Fiedler has called teenage impersonators. I'll stop there. So, comments. Do you recognize what he's describing here? The conscious sinking.
There's a couple of things going on there. I mean, writers, like men of letters, artistic types, they tend to be. You only see this, and we'll actually probably get into this a little bit more when we talk about Class X, because these are Class X persons that we're talking about, and
he's drifting towards that. That's right.
Yeah, but with writers, it is particularly interesting because, especially since the 19th century, you'll see these. I call these little clouds of bohemianism that spring up occasionally in history. They're actually relatively hard to detect if you look at the historical record. We see one of them at ancient Rome in the 1st century. We see them in the 19th century again on the left bank in Paris. Mm-hmm. And you see them in Russia, and then you see one in the 1960s in America. Right. But the important thing is that really especially since the 19th century, they tend to be romantics, like capital R romantics, and they're usually miasmatically poisoned by the legend of somebody like Lord Byron or Charles Baudelaire or something like that.
Like they want to relive some arc that they've read about, right?
Yeah, to become the Byronic hero. But there's another aspect to it that I think is genuinely that, first of all, like a lot of the ones that I named, they were homosexuals, which I think is worth pointing out. And then there's the rough trade meme is feeding into this, which I'm not even going to get into. You can Google that one yourself, because it's just like, this is the proclivity for upper class homosexual men to go get buggered by working class, pay working class men. That's definitely what's going on with lesbians. That's absolutely what's going on with lesbians. Mm-hmm. But there's also, I think there's a bit of anxiety about the fact that, okay, because if you're doing the man of letters thing, if you're self-consciously doing this, you've likely blown past a number of firewalls in your social network already. Like, there have been a lot of people that have told you not to do this, okay? Yeah. And that the thing that it leads to is downward social mobility. And so there is probably an attempt in large measure to preempt that decline in social status by instead of sinking to the bottom, to just go ahead and dive to the bottom.
Oh, I see.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Preemptive strike.
you present it as a fait accompli, you know, and so that's sort of a way to reclaim the agency in the issue. Like you were going to end up this way, but I'm going to do it on my terms, you know.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to jump in with the next thing from him on this. He says, "Few sink successfully as rise credibly." That's very interesting. Note what he said there, Sam Batch. He thinks that as much as people fail to rise, those who do sometimes are able to kind of pull it off, right? But he says it's actually harder to sink and pull it off. And why? Because
falling with style.
Yeah, no matter how much effort you expend, if your language doesn't give you away, your grammar will, or your taste in clothes or cars or ideas. Basically, he's pointing back to everything he's been talking about in the book. There's so many going through there. It made me feel very self-conscious, you know, because you're reading it and like, oh, I didn't even think that was like a class thing, you know. You don't realize how many ways you give it away. And he's saying it's really hard to hide it when you have been brought up, you know, upper class or, you know, upper middle or upper class or top out of sight. And now you're going to pretend to be a low proletarian, and actual low proletarians are just rolling their eyes. They're like, no, man, we're not buying it. Right.
You know, there's all kinds of things that will give you away, like a tendency to have a junk drawer or something like that. There are all these little markers, and like one of them, for instance, is like the way you go about taking a second portion of food at dinner. That will give you away. There are all kinds of little finger marks.
He didn't bring that one.
I don't want to give away too much.
Tell us that one. Tell us about the second portion of dinner. Which class does what?
Well, like there are people who are like self-conscious about taking the last asparagus roll or something like that. That's usually indicating a lower class status, actually, because wealthier people, they're actually not going to be really that worried about it. They're going to do it again in a couple of hours or whatever, or something like that. So they're not as concerned about resource dividing. Okay. So
I see.
If you're from a lower class, you get a lot of bugbears in your head about how resources are going to be divided, and this is the thing that it's very hard to shake. Now, I will say I won't give away too much about my own background. I think most people could probably put it together if they really try.
I've been reading the book. I thought about you a lot, actually. You came to mind, and I'm like trying to pigeonhole you, and I'm like, I don't know. I think I need more data.
but I mean, my background is such that I've spent a lot of my life doing things like traveling around the United States, and that involves, sometimes you run out of money when you do that, and taking jobs that normally somebody with several college degrees wouldn't take. Like I've worked on shrimp boats, I've worked on cattle farms, things like that.
Right.
And it is very different. No matter how long I have been out of what I would refer to as the upper class, there are things that I do that give me away, and I'm never really trusted. Like I'll get called a college boy, or there's I never really get included in the group. Like they'll let me hang around.
They pick up on it.
Yeah.
And do they pick up on it pretty fast?
Yeah, real fast. And it's usually with me, it's the vocabulary, it's the way I talk. I use words that have to be that you know. But there's a lot more. By
the way, I'm in a not an interracial relationship, but an interclass relationship. You know, in my marriage, and one of the things my wife hates is when she asks me about a word, and I'm like, or a phrase, and I say, "Oh, everybody knows that," and she looks at me like she's going to kill me. You know?
Yeah. I mean, but you know, because you can accidentally make people feel uncomfortable. It's probably not so bad with your wife, but you know, like with somebody you don't know, it prevents you from getting jobs. I have a very difficult time finding work in, especially what you would call like the high to low proletarian range, because almost anytime I'm talking to a social manager, what I serve without trying to at all is that I'm somebody who could potentially take your job.
Got it. Yeah, they don't want that. They just want a peon who will be a peon and be happy being a peon. Right.
Yeah. They're not like, I've had managers that were distinctly uncomfortable with being my manager. But I would talk
Yeah.
on the subject of downward mobility in general. I would think when Pauly was writing this book, downward mobility was kind of a hush hush topic, and I think it's interesting because like most of millennial status anxiety, and class anxiety generally stems from the tendency to downward mobility that we're seeing right now. So
Hmm. Yeah.
if
Yeah.
if the
In fact,
20th,
let me jump in because now we're going to introduce what I decided to title the episode, his notion of prole drift. Okay. And it kind of connects to what you're talking about. He says, in a melancholy sense, the whole society could be said to be engaged in a process of class sinking. Prole drift, we can call it, a term that will suggest the tendency in advanced industrialized societies for everything inexorably to become proletarianized. He says it seems an inevitable attendant of mass production, mass selling, mass communication, mass education. Some of its symptoms are bestseller lists, films that must appeal to virtually everyone except the intelligent, sensitive, and subtle, shopping malls. Prole drift is another term for what Bloomberg calls the Howard Johnsonization of America. And he says evidence of prole drift is everywhere. Look at magazines and newspapers. He talks about the disappearance during the 1940s of the table of contents from the front cover of the Atlantic and its replacement by a picture. Uh, uh, let's see. The anthropologist Marcelo Truzzi, examining this country's newspapers in 1972, found that while 20 years earlier, only about 100 of the 1,750 daily papers carried astrological columns, now 1,200 did. I'll give you a little more and then let you comment. Similar evidence will confront you the minute you inquire into what has happened at your local bookstore. He talks about Roger Price's first law: if everybody doesn't want it, nobody gets it. So it's sinking down to lowest common denominator.
yeah,
Now that's shifted now in bookstores because it's just books selected by women, written by women, and sold to women. But anyway, this is a little bit later after he wrote this book, that development. These impediments they try to rationalize by renaming. Oh, I'm sorry. And then he talks about how you can't do special orders. That actually didn't ring true for me, and I was there in the 80s ordering books. But he does say customers will be encouraged to cleave rigidly to the bestseller list, permitting themselves an interest only in things which the bookstore manager has thought it profitable to order in quantity. And he refers to Ortega. What's his name? Jose Ortega Gasset. You know what I mean? Ortega's gloomy finding that the mass crushes beneath it everything that is different, everything that is excellent, individual, qualified, and select, which is a way of saying
now
that
I'm a little
proles,
less cynical here.
let me give you one last sentence and then I want you to comment, which is a way of saying that proles who superficially look like losers have a way of always winning. So comments.
Now this is interesting because again, I would say that Fussell was writing this at an interesting time in American life, and what you're really talking about there is the disappearance of what is the disappearance or the desegmentation of culture. I would point out that at the time when he was writing this, the United States was engaged in a kind of a collective project, and it was spearheaded by Hollywood in a lot of ways, that in such that we decided, and this is a progressive reform. This is like Wilsonian, Rooseveltian progressive concept, and I like those guys, and like not to get into why I like those guys too much, but they did believe in the concept of civilizational uplift. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
so what their idea was.
You mean they were progressives?
Yeah, exactly.
In the old
came
sense.
to the conclusion. Yeah, they came to the conclusion that what we could in fact bring, and this is where the Harvard, the great books, the Harvard, like
Mm-hmm.
Mr.
Well,
Elliott's 5 foot
there's
shelf
University of
books,
Chicago, I thought, but yeah.
No, it's Harvard. Yeah, it's
Okay.
There might be other ones. There might be other ones, but the original one is from Harvard.
Okay.
And but the idea is that we're going to take things like cinema and the arts and so on and so forth, and air travel, and we're going to bring them to the masses. And by experiencing this world, by experiencing these like sort of higher order functions of culture, that we're actually going to create this, to use a Greek word, a utropilian society. Now, I have criticized this a number of times because I think this is the failure of the WASP himself, the ethnicity, the WASP. This is a failure on our part because we, among other things, we didn't really recognize that there were hard limits. We didn't recognize that you can't just make you can't just do this with multicultural societies. And we didn't realize that by like, you can't just, anytime you sort of mix these things in with one another, anytime you mix cinema in with lower, like people who are interested in lower order stories, what you're necessarily doing is bringing the mean down. And
which
really,
is what he describes, right? We're just going to end up with the lowest common denominator movies and stuff. You know?
Right. This is what postmodernism does in a lot of ways. Because when you think about the difference between postmodernism and modernism, one of them, modernism assumes a great deal, like T.S. Eliot's definition of tradition, which is, he says it's something you can't inherit. It has to, if you want tradition, it has to be obtained by great labor. And so whenever you're looking at modernists, when you're looking at, I use literature more than I use anything else, but whenever you use, but it works with magazines, it works with cinema, it works with everything. All of these things that came into the world as relatively high status, or modern poetry, for instance. So like if you're going to read The Wasteland, he uses 14 different languages in The Wasteland. There's there's an assumption on the part of the agency on the part of the reader that's not there with postmodernism. When we'll see postmodernism deals with a lot of the same themes, but take Thomas Pynchon for somebody, or even Cormac McCarthy, these more famous postmodern writers, instead of assuming that the reader has read a lot of Greek mythology, what they're going to assume is that they've seen a lot of movies. And so we see Pynchon's books taking on this noir element where, you know, the symbols and tropes he surrounds himself are things that are associated with middle class to lower middle class culture in the 1940s. So it's this shoving down of everything. But I will say that I think all of this happened as a result of really America's victory. There's some MK Ultra elements here going on as well, but maybe not get into those too much. But this was a push on on the part of America to enact something that the historian Elizabeth Cohen calls growth liberalism. Okay, which is the idea that everything can just keep always getting better. But now that we see this downward movement, because this really, it sort of ends, it crashes out sometime between Watergate and the second oil crisis. And we've seen downward mobility has been probably more prevalent since then. And one of the things that we've seen as a result of this, though, is in a lot of ways, the re-esoterization of culture itself. So like, whenever you like, there's like, you know, there's bookstores, and there's bookstores that sell like the top 100 trash and everything now, but there's also usually an indie bookstore. There's, you know, you can there's esoteric Twitter circles, there's alt lit, there's like, you know, art films and that sort of thing that that will generally allow people who have become financially downward mobile, but they still have a good education, to sort of re-grasp some of their status by, you know, displaying signals of like sort of high culture behavior. Right. So there's kind of a small movement. There's kind of a small movement back the other way in terms of when you see this with like the proliferation of like highbrow indie magazines.
Because one of the themes that he has throughout the book is it's kind of an anti-egalitarian book, I guess you could say, because he's saying he pokes fun at all the classes. I mean, from top to bottom, he teases everybody, right? Sometimes it feels like a knife is digging in a little bit sometimes. But anyway, but it helps you enjoy his description of the classes. But a running theme is that these distinctions are okay. And one of the things that most annoys him is people who can't just sort of accept who they are and that they're in a certain class and just be cool with it. So that's why he picks on the middle class in particular, who's sort of uncomfortable being middle class.
Yeah, they're the most fun to pick on.
Yeah. And so he thinks that it's like, it's okay that we have distinctions, right? I mean, this is your classic anti-egalitarian view. it's okay that we have distinctions. You shouldn't spend all your time trying to get out of your box and struggling against it. And it's a shame this Prole Drift that he's identifying, he doesn't like. He's saying this is bad. It's a mushing together. It's a loss of distinction. And basically, you're saying, yeah, but if you look at the margins, the distinctions are coming back. They're coming back in new ways or something,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I think he's being vindicated here because I mean, this project didn't work and it created a mess.
Yeah,
Okay,
right, right.
It created the mess that we've been in for the last maybe 20 years or so.
Yeah.
But I mean, we may just now be at this point where we're just really restarting to just sort of realize, okay, yeah, not everybody is capable. Not everybody is interested in like the products that like art students creates, but there is a market for it. There is a market for it. And then meanwhile, the mainstream slop is getting worse and worse. And those are the people that haven't yet. So what's really interesting is there's a differentiation in the world now between people who kind of get it and people who don't. And that's a filter that he doesn't really take into account because it wasn't a distinction that existed yet. He's writing at a very particular time.
Yeah. Okay, so conscious of time, I want to get us to this last chapter because this is particularly why I thought of bringing Sam Batch on. First of all, just to tee us up, we've already got it in the chat. Jules Roy says, it's a good book, but the last chapter is bad. Class X Cope. Okay, so, and I saw this in reviews of the book. People are like, hey, great book, except for that weird last chapter. So let's see what we think of it. And I'm particularly going to be curious about Sam Batch's reaction. Let me read you a little to introduce it, and then let Sam Batch comment. Okay, so what does he mean? The last chapter is called The X Way Out. So what does he mean about this, about X people? He says, X people are better conceived as belonging to a category than a class, because you are not born an X person, as you are born and reared a prole or a middle or whatever. You become an X person, or to put it more bluntly, you earn X personhood by a strenuous effort of discovery in which curiosity and originality are indispensable. And in discovering that you become an X person, you can become an X person, you find the only escape from class. So it does feel weird, right? He spent the whole book saying, yeah, mostly people are kind of stuck. And then he says, well, maybe there is a way out, and he spends the whole chapter talking about it. So who is he talking about here? What kind of people?
Well, he's talking about himself.
Yeah, well,
excuse me. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. We'll hold that. I know. What kind of people are X's? The old-fashioned term bohemians gives some idea. So does the term the talented. He says some X's are intellectuals, but a lot are not. They're actors, musicians, artists, sports stars, celebrities, well-to-do former hippies, confirmed residers abroad, and the more gifted journalists. X people can be described as self-cultivated. They tend to be self-employed, doing what social scientists call autonomous work. If, as Mills has said, the middle-class person is always somebody's man, the X person is nobody's, and his freedom from supervision is one of his most obvious characteristics. X people are independent-minded, free of anxious regard for popular shibboleths, loose in carriage and demeanor. They adore the work they do, and they do it until they are finally carried out. Retirement being a concept meaningful only to hired personnel or wage slaves who despise their work. Being an X person is like having much of the freedom and some of the power of a top out of sight or upper class person, but without the money. X category is a sort of unmoneyed aristocracy. Okay, he's got a lot more to say, but having introduced the audience to this concept of the X person, what do you think of this? Is this BS, like so many people say?
I mean, it's me. It's me, and it's all the people that I hang out with. And it sounds terrible. It sounds terrible to say this because I mean, it's not a popular. It's not. There is a sort of a third rail in American life about really talking about these people because for a lot of reasons. First of all, you don't want too many of them, and we'll get into that in a second. But also, like all the only groups of people who can look at those people without what I would point out is almost always a little tinge of jealousy are the top out of sight and the bottom out of sight. Everyone else, like sort of
like feels a little trapped by their position and the expectations from their family and from their class and from society. right? And you're saying the top out of sight and bottom out of sight kind of don't care, and the X person doesn't care, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, the X person to me, I think I this is the group of people that I'm always looking for, like real, like I'm always looking for evidence of them in history. It's like I said, I find them. You tend to find them at times of in interesting historical junctures. So the earliest one that I'm aware of was the sort of the. I mean, they exist at all times, but there are definitely blooms in numbers of Class X persons. Now, to say that anybody can become one is it's true, but without a doubt, the highest number of the archetypical construction of one is somebody who is from the upper class or the top out of sight, and they went to school or something like that, and like for instance, me. Like had a nervous breakdown my last year of engineering school, and at the thought of sitting in a control room turning knobs for the rest of my life,
Yeah.
and then went and I've learned now that I've read all of this shit. Like I'm aware of another world that's out there. I'm gonna have to go find a way to make that work.
Mm-hmm.
So they tend to become one. There really is a bit of downward mobility that's involved. But there is this sort of there is a lateral escape as well, which is that like once you're outside of that column, the column itself starts to look very strange. And there's another reading of it where it can be read as this is the American dream in a lot of ways. This is like as originally conceived. This is the sort of American dream, and this class of people is they're referred to. I mean, you could call them bohemians. More recently, in the last 20 years or so, they've been associated with, in particular, Bitcoin and like what you would call the Gilles, the Guattari and Deleuze's like sort of nomad lifestyle. Nick Land is the king of Class X, if that makes sense. Like
Really?
Nick Land is the king of Class X.
Huh.
But to call them bohemians, that's like okay. That's when he's using bohemian, he's using this in a different way because remember that growth liberalism concept that was floating a second ago. Like when most people think about hippies and they think about like countercultures and that sort of thing, they're referring to a democratized version of it. Okay, so this is like one of these things where we have like repackaged the concept of counterculture and we've sold it in such a way like the Dime Square people are the best example that I can think of this sort of reification of counterculture. They, like people who are living in New York on like they're living in New York and they're trying to be writers at the same time they're holding down day jobs or something like that.
Right.
And what they're really looking for is the upside of that X-menship without the downside of it, which is so like whenever it's a very difficult thing to do if you're going to remain stationary in a place that's very expensive like New York. And you're also the reason you would do this, the reason you would remain in New York City is for the status aspect of living in New York City. So you're actually by participating that way, you're already disqualifying yourself from being a real X because you're concerned about the status of living in New York City. You tend to find real ones. When you find the real ones, they're usually living in Baltimore, Santa Fe, New Orleans.
Yeah, so
you're
you're saying visiting New York City, drifting through it might be okay for an Xer, but actually staying there and dealing with the expense of that just to say I live in Manhattan or something.
Yeah, that's what I say about New York. What I say about New York is you got to check in every now and then to make sure your agent's still alive. But
okay, so let me jump in. I want to give the audience a little bit more of basically he has spent this whole book going into extraordinary detail about how the different classes dress and so forth. So now he's going to do I'm going to jump around a little bit, give a lightning tour of what the X's are like in regards to all these various details that he's been covering in the book, right? So X people tend to dress for themselves alone, which means they dress comfortably and generally down. When an X person, male or female, meets a member of an identifiable class, the costume, no matter what it is, conveys the message, I am freer and less terrified than you. Or in extreme circumstances, I am more intelligent and interesting than you are. Please do not bore me. Didn't you just tweet something about how you hate being bored? Anyway,
I hate boring. Yeah, no, that's
yeah,
what it is. And really,
that's you.
I
That's
mean,
you.
this is a very hyper specific construction of it that is again based on the 19th century idea of, in particular, the bohemian. And so you use this
Yeah.
like Walter Pater to burn always with this bright gem like flame to maintain this ecstasy as success in life. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's like the classic Anglo-American construction of it, like
Yep.
without a doubt. But I mean, I would point out also that like because these people can be politically engaged. Julius Caesar is a great example of one. He's from this old Roman family. He's incredibly educated, but he's adopting transgressive norms because he's sick and because he's like sort of sick of his own class's behavior, the behavior of the Roman conservative. And so what he does is he starts doing things like he adopts Greek morals. He adopts Greek fashion. You know, he trims his hair like a Greek. He speaks in public about things that are not things that the traditional Roman aristocracy is going to speak about.
Mm-hmm.
When Xers are political, they tend to be radical populists. This is another distinction between them and, say, what we would think of today as the well-to-do hippies. I don't really know, because they tend to cluster in like sort of the progressive upper middle class sort of moral zone. Whereas when you find like genuine Xers, they're usually politically allied. They're usually politically allied with the mid-proletarian down to the destitute. Maybe not so much the bottom out of sight, but they tend to be populists. And one of the things about this class of people is they are probably the most politically dangerous class of people, because they, first of all, don't have anything to lose. Second of all, they tend to be relatively educated. They tend to be relatively agentic. Okay. And whenever they do adopt a framework, a political framework, the framework they adopt tends to be from the perspective of a very unshakable moral system. Okay. And that makes them dangerous to people who are sort of interested in relativistic upward mobility. The state, in fact, this makes them dangerous to the state. And so there's everywhere and always. And like, you know, when one of the things George Bataille talks about this more than anything else, is that he, you know, conceives of society as the solar anus, actually. But, you know, he has a book called The Accursed Share, where he talks about how the arts and things like this they're self-conscious expenditures of energy that are sacrificed to the sun god or whatever. But one of the things that's interesting is that these people do seem to have, and we can see by the lack of them, by their invisibility in the current world. So they existed in the 50s. They don't exist now. They do bring something to the table, you know, in like the same way like gut flora brings something to the table for the health. It's hard to pin down exactly what you need these people for, but you definitely want some of them around. Otherwise, and I think maybe what they do, one of the things they do is they sort of grease the space between the other classes. They provide some lubrication between the other classes, so they're not constantly at one another's throats. So they do provide, and so to use another Landian term, exit. You know, the Landian concept of exit. This is exit into the middle, exit into the X class. You know, spatially, a group of people that has a problem with their mother state, they can exit and create a new state. Okay, if you're seriously bummed out by this class system, if it's not serving you well, then you can choose exit, and there is a place for you to go. You know. I mean, that's probably the best way to explain them. But, you know, like today, when you think of today examples of them, because I mean, these are the people that I hang out with, you know, quite a bit. They live in a world that's hard to see. They do still exist, but you know, when I was younger, I mean, my on ramp.
And when you talk about that, not kind of invisibility socially, I think your point is that there was a time when an Xer would be like a well-known person, I guess, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. What would be a good? Give me a couple examples of people who would have been well known at the time, but not really fitting into a class and being in this category.
Gore Vidal, and Gore Vidal is a sort of classic one. But then there are, even in the 70s, there are even more democratized versions of it. Tom Wolfe is a great
Mm-hmm.
example of somebody
Yeah.
who is a sort of X-class person. Hunter S. Thompson, to a lesser extent, he's a more proletarian version of it.
Yeah.
I think maybe the last one was sort of David Foster Wallace. Cormac McCarthy is an example of one. David Foster Wallace is probably the most recent. Like, there's a reason he has like such a cult following, because he was kind of like the archetypical X, you know.
Okay, let me read a little more here. So give you more fodder. So regardless of the work they do, the X's read a great deal, and they regard reading as a normal part of experience, as vital as experience, and often more interesting. They never belong to book clubs. They choose their own books entirely themselves. The X-reader reads everything, his curiosity being without limit. Being entirely self-directed, X-people pursue remote and uncommonplace knowledge. They may be fanatical about Serbo-Croatian prosody, geodes, or Northern French church vestments of the 11th century. When in a flux of joy, X-people burst into song, the air is likely to derive from opera of the Baroque period, or from Don Giovanni or the Messiah. Although X-people abjure the word creative, regarding it as stylish, sentimental, psychologically naive, and therefore middle class, they adopt toward cultural objects the attitude of makers, and of course, critics. With films, X-people are as interested in the styles of directors as of actors. Yeah, okay, that's enough. I wanted to get some of his cultural commentary on the X person.
That's interesting. I wonder if he's the origin, the distinction between creators and makers, because that's a distinction that you see a lot these days. I mean, he's right. He's right. But like, there's a tendency to want to like lump this type of person in with the college professor. But there are
which he does not make that mistake, right?
Right. But it's a lot of this sort of leveling that we've seen, a lot of this sort of like really commercialization of Xness that has kind of robbed Xness of its pungency. Okay, in the last 30 years, the way I got this way is you could still find these people when I was younger. You know, I mean, I'm from New Orleans, so it made it easier. They tend to collect here. But like these people are still around, and you can be initiated into the circle of Xness, you know, and then all of a sudden, and instead you find yourself on a plane to California, and you're being driven out to the desert with a bunch of mod synth artists, and like everyone has a math PhD, and they're not doing anything with it, you know. Okay, but like this, and this is where that sense of resentment sort of comes from. I think a lot of people, and this is probably dangerous for me to start talking like this, but that's actually my Xness right there. That's like, I shouldn't turn around and talk about this. You know, because like I could offend people, I could make them mad or something like that. And I did say a couple of days ago, I said you can still do true bohemianism, but it does exact a toll. Okay. This is a difference between, say, me and say maybe a dime square person that also has like a finance bro job or something like that. People tend to look at the Xers in those like moments of exuberance or whatever and think, oh, what a great lifestyle, you know, or whatever. But what they don't see is that the flip side of it, when things are actually remarkably difficult and you get no sympathy whatsoever because you don't have a job and you've never really tried to get a job or anything like that. Okay, you always constantly have to live with the fact that downside results are your responsibility, and there's nobody coming to help you.
And you could imagine the disappointed father stereotype here coming in with the Xer, right? You know, why don't you make something of yourself? Why don't you do like a normal life? Do a normal life, have a normal career, you know, right?
And it just doesn't make sense. But I mean, I would like to people who'd be like, this idea that this class exists is wrong or whatever. If that's coming from a place of resentment, I just going to tell you there are a lot of downsides that don't get publicized as often.
Yeah.
So like maybe don't feel so bad about it. I mean, essentially what you're doing with X.
Part of this is movies, right? I think movies are going to romanticize this sort of person and show them being sort of free and artistic and flowing around hippie-like in the world, and not show that when they're eating cans of beans for 5 weeks, you know, or whatever, right?
Yeah, you know, my favorite painting ever is called A Bloomsbury Family, and it's a painting by you know, you're familiar with the Bloomsburys, I'm sure, because
the Bloomsbury group, John Maynard Keynes,
intimately associated with my favorite economist ever. and the and the Fabian Society. But it's a painting
This is Sir William Orpen, right?
Sir William Orpen, who also did an incredible portrait of Woodrow Wilson. It's probably the greatest presidential portrait.
Now this just looks like a normal family. What am I seeing here?
Okay, well, I'm waiting for it to come up. Are you gonna put it on the?
No, I don't have a fast way to do it.
Okay,
so go ahead.
Yeah, but okay. If you look, first of all, it's an allusion to a previous the Arnold Feeney portrait. So if you look, at the mirror is there in the background. That's an allusion to the Arnold Feeney portrait. But what you're looking at is a well-to-do English family in the early 20th century. But there are some deliberately bohemian choices here. If you look at the trappings, everyone is educated. It looks like a normal family, but if you look around, the room is kind of dark. The paintings are all like slightly askew. There's evidence of a mind that's not disordered, but it's not necessarily concerned with keeping up appearances. They seem comfortable, but it's delicate. The whole situation here is quite delicate. If you sort of know what you're looking at. I had something else right on the tip of my brain, and then I lost it. But the sort of what was it? There was something about X mentality.
Well, let me read a little more so I can get a little more in, because I am wanting to let you go in about 20 minutes because you got that thing coming. Oh, I'm almost at the end of the book. Okay, here we go. There's the last little bit I want to do. So go ahead.
I had to cancel on D because somebody's actually coming in tonight. So Spader's coming in tonight. So I gotta go hang out with him. And I think he's gonna. I think his plane lands in an hour. So I'm not in a hurry.
And missing Lynch. Okay. So I'm sorry. You said you are in a hurry or not in a hurry?
Not in a hurry.
Okay, because you're not going and picking him up from the airport.
Yeah.
Okay. In St. Louis, that's what we would do. Anyway. X people tend to make their own rules and to get away with so doing, which means that many of them are writers. And as Diana Trilling has said, if everyone wants to be a writer, this is not only because of the promise of celebrity, but also because of what the life of the artist promises of freedom to make one's own rules. X people are verbal. They're good at languages and take it for granted that it is disgraceful because merely American and provincial to remain monolingual. It's the shame of my life. I've studied so many languages, I'm still not bilingual.
I don't know about that one. That one, I actually view. This is me, just as like a live interview with an Xer. Though there are a lot of them that are like that. I'm so Anglophilic that I sort of think that making fun of somebody for being monolingual, if that language is English, it's a little bourgeoisie to complain about somebody.
Yeah. Soliciting no reputation for respectability. X people are freely obscene and profane, but tend to deploy vile language with considerable rhetorical effectiveness, differing from proles by using fucking as a modifier only now and then and never dropping the G. Never saying fucking, right? This will suggest that generally they eschew euphemism, as for example, when they insist that their children use the words penis and vagina. When an X person lifts one eyebrow slightly while referring to someone as a confirmed bachelor, we are to gather that flaming homosexual is meant. These are the euphemisms that he does.
Yeah, it's exactly what that means. It's exactly what that means. Yeah, confirmed bachelor means queer is a $3 bill.
Yeah, and then he gives a few more examples. Starlet is the ironic euphemism for whore, constant companion for lover, tired or overtired for publicly drunk, and fun-loving for promiscuous. And this one, I thought of you. He's describing your dream girl here. And applied to young women, willowy means near death from anorexia.
Yeah.
Do you like him willowy, Sandbatch?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would, one of the things that's interesting about Xness is that it is preternaturally, it is like typically almost solely publicly associated with men. Okay, you do not. There are women, of course. There are women, but Xness is severely male coded in the public eye. And
this. So wait. I'm sorry. So there's the public perception, which you're talking about, But in reality, is it 50-50 male female, or would certainly be
No.
predominantly male?
What do you think? Well, what does your Twitter follow list look like? Okay, I mean, like when you're
Yeah.
like when you're getting to like the early alt right was an example of that. It was an X movement. It was genuine,
Yeah.
genuine countercultural movement. Like I mean,
And
we still see
very
like,
male, very intellectual. Yeah.
what happens if you're a member of the Young Republicans and your Twitter and your chats get leaked and you're using bad language? You're inside this column, you're inside this status column, and you get punished for it.
Yeah.
You get sent, you get sent down to the bottom. And so like I mean along with transgressiveness itself, it tends to be associated with, but this is what we're doing. We're looking at what is our euphemism for that column system. We call it the longhouse. You know, okay, there are women, there are women, and they do, and like, you know, like I sort of ham it up quite a bit. They tend to be when you find X women, they tend to be extremely high dimensional and sort of like dangerous, and because there's like we tend to think, because there's an element of transgression in Xness.
Yeah.
It's like, this is what it is. It's like you're the transgressive class. And that's something that we typically associate risk taking, because this is what you're doing is when you're stepping outside the class system, what you're doing is you're taking on risk. So when I last worked in a corporate job, this is the kind of thing I do. Because ChatGPT had just come out, in addition to trying to automate my entire job with ChatGPT just for funsies.
Yeah.
I was calculating how much of the value that I generate for this company is like coming back to me in the form of my salary. And I came out to something like 5%. Okay. You know, and it's an incredibly low number. And I look at it and I'm like, well, okay, so what I need to do here actually is that if this is very clearly somewhere, the ability to make this amount of money on my own under my own agency clearly exists. Now there's all kinds of countervailing things like economies of scale for working with large firms, thing like that. But I mean, like I'm generating, like what I'm doing is that I'm trading stability. So like I'm actually taking out a short position on myself. So like I'm betting that, I'm sort of betting that the value of my labor is going to go down between now and the next paycheck, which gets fed to me at a steady number. But if I leave, okay, I have to eat the downside. But what I'm doing is I'm placing a long position on myself, and I'm saying I can do better than this.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the
go independent. Yeah.
Yeah. Take the assumption of risk that you're responsible for whatever happens to you and there's questions of whether or not any of us are really doing that. Are we sponging off a society that has a safety net, so on and so forth? Yeah, I mean, to one extent or another, like, okay, yeah, so like somebody could go become an entrepreneur or whatever, but they're still on Obamacare or something like that.
Yeah, right.
I would suggest that robust social safety nets are actually good in particular for Xers, but at base, what you're doing is you're taking you've got this idea that I'm a fully formed person who has agency, and I can be responsible for all of my upside and all of my downside, and the people that I'm interacting with because they tend to cluster, as Xers will tend to cluster together, that everyone else has made that same assumption about themselves. And this is where like, despite not being a libertarian at all, this is the source of my crossover with libertarians. And I think in the early alt-right, this was the source of our crossover with libertarians as well, because there are a lot of those same assumptions that are being made about risk appetite. And so, what am I trading my promotion for the ability to say what I want to online to my friends? Yeah, you are a little bit. That's a very X-coded thing to do. But I mean, I would point out that not necessarily everything, like the actual art world today is pretty upper middle class coded. So like a lot of the things that are associated that have been associated with Xness in the past aren't really anymore, because they've been reified. This is where that Marxist phrase reified comes from. And reified means, grabbed by capitalism and pulled into that columnar structure we've been talking about.
Yeah. Sold back to you. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me finish this chapter, and then actually there's a little appendix thing that is so fun, and it'll be brief to get through. So wrapping up his commentary on the X category, he says, scrutinizing the British social classes over a century ago, Matthew Arnold identified the standard three and then observed that each class has in it people he termed aliens, those who feel they don't belong there and want out. It's largely from their current American counterparts that the X group is recruited. He mentions Gore Vidal, by the way, and James Jones. Do you know who that
I would
is?
also point out. Yeah, I would also point out that Matthew Arnold is the person who made that "To Burn Always with This Hard Gem-Like Flame." That's him.
There we go.
And,
Oh yeah. In fact, let me read his two examples a little more depth. He says some members like Gore Vidal enter X from the upper class. Some, like James Jones, come from the proles or even the destitute. One can have as little education as Jones, or as much as the brilliant kids from the more demanding universities who have developed confidence in their intellect and taste there. X people constitute something like a classless class. They occupy the one social place in the USA where the ethic of buying and selling is not all powerful. People fearful that Xhood may be somehow un-American should realize that, on the contrary, it is firmly in the American grain. Knowing that
Thomas Jefferson was the first one. Thomas Jefferson.
A good point. Good, yes. Right. Knowing that, Mark Twain created an exemplary Category X person and said, when first introducing him, Huckleberry came and went at his own free will.
Yeah, it's the American. It's what I mean. It's the American dream.
Yeah. That's interesting. So being an X is what you would see as the American dream, because it's been sold to us in the 50s as the American dream is to move up a notch on this scale I've got on the screen, right? Move up to the next level. And you're saying the real American dream is nobody's my boss. I call my own shots. I take responsibility for my life, and I'm free, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally. I mean, actually, there's a great book that I can't remember. It's about the anti-federalists that really they correspond quite a bit to Xers. But I mean, Jefferson fits the mold so perfectly that he even he was famous for he spent more than 3 times his presidential salary on wine to entertain people while he was president.
Right.
He bought fancy French clothes and then ripped holes in them and to follow the French style of rusticare, where it was fashionable. And like after he retired, instead of hanging out with
I'm sorry, you're literally saying Thomas Jefferson was doing the contemporary equivalent of torn jeans, right?
Yes, yeah.
That is so funny.
He totally was.
I didn't know that.
And then but the and of course he even had a BPD art hoe and Maria Cosway whenever he was living in Europe. She was
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's just beautiful, like the equivalent of a late 18th century e-girl, who was also she was the divorced. I mean, no, she was the widow of a famous artist, and she was herself. She was quite beautiful, and she was also artistic. And they, of course, they never married. But yeah, I mean, to call this the American dream, though, this is a function of me, and I would also be willing to point out that I think a lot of Xers, one of the things that we have in common is that dubious heritage American status. And that tends to form the basis of our classlessness. So you can become this from the bottom and you can become this from the top. Becoming it from the middle is probably more difficult, but it's sort of a flight outside of like what's referred to as the Great Gatsby, the plastic American dream, which is like sort of when people talk about that as the Great Gatsby or whatever is the American dream, the status upward mobility is the American dream. I'm like, what are you talking about? The American dream is living on a mountain in California, okay. But I mean, this is that frontier mindset, which is that people homesteaders tend to be Xers.
Yeah.
People who are self-consciously do that. That's really what the contemporary X class is. It's like people that go to the wagon box, and they're like, they're in crypto, they're in AI startups, they're on the edge of everything that hasn't been commercialized. And like if you talk about it in polite society, you still get the eyebrow raised at you. They're people who are going to be taking risks, and that's, to me, that's the Anglo, as an Anglo-American, that's the dream. To assume risk for your own behaviors, to live in a community of other people who are doing more or less the same thing, and I guess the economics of it extrapolates outward to a lot of there are a lot of them that are libertarians. Of course, there are a lot of them that are like me too, who are like, no, we need this social system, guys. Otherwise, private charity is not going to continue paying for our health insurance.
Right.
But I think that proclivity for Xness is probably correlated non-inversely to what point your family entered the American context, because what we're essentially describing is the early concept of the American dream, which is like, total autonomy of the self, freedom of conscience. With conscience is the one that is this is the, and I always like to distinguish.
This is how you wouldn't think that the Puritans have anything to do with Class X, but you're saying in a strange way there's a connection there. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just jump to one last thing, if you don't mind staying with me. He has a little section in the back, which is in the appendix, called the mailbag, and it is hilarious, and just had to go through it. It's not long. He has, did he make these up? I don't know. Supposedly people wrote to him and he wrote back about various questions about class. So this kind of wraps up the whole series we've been doing here, and it's great fun. So real quick. Dear sir, we are a young couple about to buy our first home. May we assume that a fireplace has more status than a garage? The hopefuls. Dear hopefuls, it does, but the garage shows. Go for the garage. And don't say home, it's vulgar. You say house.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Not condemn them for the question, to just answer the question honestly. That's very X-coded.
Yeah. Dear sir, what about the class aspects of standing on the sidewalk in a large city and eating a hot dog or similar viand bought from a street peddler presiding over one of those little carts? Signed, Puzzled. Dear Puzzled, only people very expensively dressed or terribly good looking can do this without impairing their status. Middle class people demean themselves further by doing this sort of thing, but uppers can confirm their high status by it, like appearing at an afternoon ball game in a costly suit, suggesting that you're doing the occasion honor. You also, in both activities. Oh, who?
Donald Trump is the king of that. That's the reason why he's so. That's the reason why he's so popular with.
He goes into the the UFC match or whatever, and he's
But he does it without dressing down. That's an instance when you can't dress down because you're not fooling anybody. You just got to go ahead and wear your pink tie.
Be who you are.
He
says you also in both activities get high class credit for your upper class magnanimity in appearing to be democratic.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, this
Jefferson
is very funny.
This is
Jefferson.
Jeffersonian.
Good. Dear sir, I am an Englishman planning to immigrate to the United States. Can you help me by explaining the class system there? T. Atkins. Dear Mr. Atkins, no, you'd never get it. Much too complicated. You must be born and nurtured here. But you should have no worries, because here the fact of British birth raises your class at least one notch, no matter how nondescript and fourth rate you may in fact be.
It's so true. Yeah, that's
that was
great.
So funny. Okay, dear sir, I have been living in Georgetown for 30 years and find I must move to Del Rio, Texas. Will I suffer a loss of caste? Nervous.
Yes.
Dear Nervous, how can you ask? You'll never be able to show your face in civilized company again. But at least, but wait, here's the punchline. But at least you're not moving to Miami.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, dear sir, to settle a bet, would you indicate some things that are vulgar? Curious. Dear Curious, I'd say these are vulgar, but in no particular order. Jerry Lewis's TV telethon. Any cultural center. Beef Wellington. Cute words for drinks like drinky poos or nightcaps. Dinner napkins with high polyester content. Colored wine glasses. I know better than that. Oil paintings depicting members of the family. Display of laminated diplomas. On the other hand, these things are not vulgar. Fireworks on the 4th of July. Sirloin steaks, paper napkins, old clothes. You should be able to infer the principle and go on from there.
Oh man, he was like there's zero misses in his list. Like this guy knew what he was talking about. There are zero misses there.
Yeah, he got it. Okay, let's see. Dear sir, my son attends Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida, but he insists on putting a Harvard sticker in the rear window of his car. Is this wrong? Worried.
Yes.
Dear Worried, it is very wrong. But at least it indicates that he's learning something down there. He may go far. Okay, last letter, in fact. Dear sir, my bank teller embarrasses me terribly by saying at the end of the transaction, have a nice day. I don't know what I'm supposed to say back. Can you help? Sincere. Dear Sincere, I suppose you can say you too or have one yourself, although this last, like have one on me, would sound a bit flippant. You should never say mind your own business. That would be very rude. The best response to "have a nice day," I think, is the one devised by a British friend of mine. He says, "Thank you, but I have other plans."
Yeah.
Perfectly polite, and yet it leaves no doubt that you are not in that person's social class.
Yeah, that's that. There's a like there tactical self-deprecation is like a great instance.
Yeah.
I really enjoy the way he goes about it. He reminds me of, and I'm like, if you want another great example, because like Exodus has for most of the last 50 years been distinctly associated with the political left. If you want, and this is maybe one of the only times I'm gonna recognize one of the canonical right-wing writers is Russell Kirk has a great book, a great essay collection called I think it's Confessions of a Bohemian Tory. That's a great collection if like you're sort of interested in this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would think most of your a significant whoever, I don't know how many people are listening right now. I would be willing to bet the concentration of Class Xers in the audience here is about 10 times the national average.
Yeah, right. Right.
So like, I mean, like it's like if it sounds like you, it probably is you, to one extent or another.
Right. Yeah. If you've been connecting to what we've been talking about here, right?
Yeah. Got some news for you,
Yeah. But not entirely good news, as you pointed out, because there's risk, there's downside risk here, and periods of discomfort, right? But it seems like it's something, like in your case, it's something you're happy to take on.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be committed. It's like there's a moment, I think, my moment did not come as long ago as you might think it did. I think there is a moment where if this is the kind of person, like Nietzsche says, happy birthday, Fred Nietzsche, yesterday, by the way, he says, become who you are. It probably happened to me about this time last year. And I was just like, this is just what I am. This is the way it's like, because like one of the worst things you can do is like
you were still thinking going into an engineering career. You were still considering it as a safety option.
I was cycling in and out of like 9-to-5 jobs is what I was doing, and they were not going well for me. And it's like, I'm like, yeah, whatever. This is just not the kind of person that I'm going to be, because the worst thing you could do, the way you bring about the really bad outcomes, is to sort of like be aware that this is the kind of person you are, and then not act on it. Like just continually try to shove yourself back into that system that you're already. It's like, it's like that line from Apocalypse Now. It's like, this is Cambodia, Captain.
I wanted to tell you, I have a very good friend. He's a guy who was a sort of a libertarian journalist in San Francisco decades ago, but moved back to St. Louis, which is where he's from. And he's been going to church with me for many years now. And he connected with me in particular, I think, when he came back to town. It blew my mind when he told me that the last time he'd had like a regular like 9-to-5 job was like decades ago. I was like, how do you live? And because we see each other every week, he'll tell me details. Well, I do this kind of like acting thing over here, and I kind of do this and I kind of do that, and it kind of depends on the season of the year what I'm doing and sort of what comes along. And I produce sometimes, like he helps with movies sometimes. He kind of does a bit of this and a bit of that.
Right. Well,
he just cannot sit in an office and report to a man. He just can't do it.
You're kind of an ex-whisperer. You understand us better than a lot of people do. But it's like there is that phrase that Klaus Schwab phrase, the "you will own nothing and be happy" line that drives everybody crazy.
And you're like sounds good, right?
Yeah, if you look at that and you're like, okay, this isn't so bad, okay, then you're probably one of us.
Yeah.
I mean, that line even rankles the like sort of proletariat left quite a bit.
Yeah.
They're all about owning. Like, yeah, whatever. Okay, yeah, I'll help you make this movie, but I got to get to Fresno. It's like that's what I'm trying to do. Like literally, what I'm doing, working. This is the kind of day in the life of an ex. What I'm doing right now is I'm typesetting 2 books. I'm building a software for myself, building a website for myself, because I am like sort of starting a sort of boutique project that I'll have more details on later. Cool. And then I'm trying to figure out how to spend the next, because I'm back in New Orleans now, but I really like living in Texas, and I'm trying to get back to Texas, but I don't want to immediately go to Texas. I want to go do some hiking. And so I'm trying to work out an itinerary for the next. This is a cool thing about being a self-conscious Xer, is that to appear whimsical requires a lot of planning.
Yeah.
You know, you have to actually, because otherwise you're just running from one fire to the next. You're like a chicken with your head cut off. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to spend most of next year in various national parks hiking, and then maybe
Right.
and then land back in Texas is what I'm.
And
So that's
so
day in the life of an ex.
I'm gonna have to wrap it up, but I hope I'm not revealing anything by asking. Well, you don't have to answer the question, but maybe we can end it here to summarize what an X is all about and the relationship to possessions. Would you please tell the people what you do after you finish reading a book?
I throw it away or I give it to somebody else, except with the exception of.
I thought sometimes you burn it.
So I've burned them if there is some reason to get burned, it has to be a book that I read and decided it was so revolting that I can neither give it to someone nor keep it.
Okay, right.
And so, like, I had a book called Existential Kink that was sitting on my that I inherited from a woman that I dated. That I thought it was so terrible. I was like, I can't give this away. So like, burning is the only thing that can be done with it. So yeah, I don't have a lot of possessions. Like, I'm all about. I do not like accruing items. Right. So like people like, oh, Spader's going to be introduced to he's going to look at me like I'm crazy when he comes in.
Oh, because there's like nothing there. The picture I always get, and I know this isn't quite fair probably to who he was, or maybe it was, I don't know. The picture that kept coming to mind sometimes in the X chapter was Steve Jobs, that famous picture where he's just got like a Tiffany lamp next to him, and otherwise there's just nothing in the room. and the reason was he had very high aesthetic standards about design and everything, and that object was the only object he could stand to like have there. Other things just didn't meet his standards, so he was like, I'd rather do without than like have a crappy couch that I can't stand. You know? Yeah,
that's beautiful. I wish Steve Jobs were still around today. We have so many down market Steve Jobs. I don't think he would have let social media become the mess that it is now. He would have intervened at some point. I think we would be living in a much better world if Steve Jobs were still around, and his down market counterparts have not filled in well, because he was kind of a one in a generation person, you know.
Yeah, true. Okay, well, thank you very much. You were, of course, I'm reading this yesterday. It was 24 hours notice, folks. I'm reading this chapter, and I'd kind of thought about Sandbach for this. And then I'm reading the chapter, and I'm like, come on. Every paragraph, I'm thinking of him. I got to get him on for this. And he was very gracious to jump in with like zero notice. But I guess that's what you do. Like, people talk about how you're like unreliable to get on streams, and I think I'm learning the trick. Don't ask like 3 weeks in advance, because he doesn't know what his life will be like in 3 weeks. Ask him like 24 hours in advance or something, right?
That's totally true. That's totally true. The best way to get me is to give me a really short timetable. Yeah. But the way I got that reputation was that was as I was sort of crashing out of the corporate world the last time. I was not. Mm-hmm. That was that thing you were talking about a year ago, where you were kind of realizing, okay, I'm just not going to be able to make this life work. Yeah. It's not who you are. I was incredibly unreliable. But again, if you're going to be an Xer, if you're going to do the X thing, one of the things you can't do is be unreliable. Okay, that's no longer on the table. You can't be a deadbeat. When you say you're going to be somewhere, you got to be there. Because your reputation is, you don't have a position. You have nothing. You have nothing except your reputation. You have yourself. Yeah, and what people think of you, and that's all you've got to live on. Okay, well, I'm going to stop for now. Thank you, sir, for jumping in at the last moment on this. I'm really glad to have finished the series with you. It was exactly the right thing to do. Worked out great. Thanks, everybody, and hopefully we'll be able to get Black Horse back on for an Econ Minis. There's a lot of stuff on our mind. We've been chatting back and forth about various things that need to be covered, like the price of gold being very, very high. He's going to dig into that and think about that a bit. Anyway, okay. Thank you, Sandbach. Have a good visit with our buddy, and I will see you all later.